Guys, this is lecture 1.5, talking about the kingdoms of Africa and the history of Africa in the periods of 1200 to 1450. African history is one of those histories that often gets neglected. It is often a misunderstood history. A lot of people think that it's just a bunch of tribes that were ripe for European conquering, but it's important to know that Africa was the cradle of civilization. This is where life originated from, and the peoples who stayed behind had some of the world's earliest states. And one of the questions that you guys are going to be comparing with in these lecture notes is, how does the state building in Africa, how is that similar and how is that different from the state building that we saw in the Americas and in China and in Islam? So we're going to kind of compare this state building and the role of government to what is happening elsewhere around the world. All right, so a little bit of context in these next two slides. This is kind of what's going on with the African kingdoms. As you guys can see, you have major routes between these Western kingdoms of we have Mali, Timbuktu. We have the Empire of Ethiopia is going to be another one as well. Hausa is going to be one. We're going to have some big influences on what is called the Trans-Saharan trade route, which is this area in purple, is going to be a very, very, very major route. And then also going between Islam, passing through the city of Cairo. Gold is going to be a major, major influence as well. And then along the coast, we've got the Swahili coast, which are going to be some very, very important trading cities are going to be created. And towards the end of this era, right near 1450, we're going to see these Portuguese voyagers start to begin to try to find a route across to the Indian Ocean. And they are going to go around the western coast of Africa, sponsored by Prince Henry. So that is going to be the arrival of the Europeans, start right at the end of this period. But let's take a look at Africa, and this is really what I want you to focus on for the context piece of it. It's time to kind of expand our horizon. So a huge, huge piece of Africa. It controls key trade routes to salt and gold. That's going to be huge. It's going to have huge, huge distances using camel caravans are going to be big. You have dominated by Arabic and Berber travelers. These are going to be major, major, major influence of religion and culture, and especially in North Africa. It's home to one of the world's greatest migrations to ever take place. That is going to go from the southern part, the southeast part of Africa to the north. We're going to look at that one. And then it's also home to the richest man in history ever. And this is all talking about the African civilization as well as the origin story of some of your favorite movies. So these are kind of some of the different city-states that we're going to look at. As you'll notice in the top left, you'll see a lot of overlap between Mali, Ghana, and the Songhai. There's a lot of overlap, but you'll see a lot of connection of the city. Timbuktu is going to be a very important one. So just to kind of get an influence, it's just also important to know just how huge the continent of Africa is. It's ginormous. So oftentimes we think of this as the size of the United States. I mean, just to kind of put it in comparison, Africa can absolutely just be huge, huge area when we're talking about this right here. All right, so starting us off with the Trans-Saharan trade route. A couple things about this. This is going to peak at pretty much after the rise of Islam, so about 700 CE, and it goes to about 1500 CE. Mostly trade is going on through camels. Camels are very, very, very efficient in the desert, but when you talk about these caravans, I know you may have heard of like a carpool caravan where you and some family members drive a couple cars together. These camels would number from about 1,000 to 12,000 camels in these trade caravans. So they're ginormous. You're also going to have these Berbers. The Berbers are actually these pirates who are centered in North Africa near Tripoli, and they're going to be fueling this trade. So the Berbers were actually very well known for raiding in the Mediterranean. That's kind of how they got a lot of their gold and riches, was from stealing and kind of raiding the Mediterranean trade. But they're also going to spread the religion of Islam as well from their capital in Tripoli. All right, so there's two main routes. The first one is from Morocco to the Niger Bend. Morocco is in just north where it says Tangiers is the city of Morocco. So it's coming through Europe, coming through Spain. Remember the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba was in Spain. Remember that other side, apart from the Abbasids when we talked about the Islamic empires. And then number two is going to be from Tunisia to Lake Chad. Tunisia was right along the coast. It was a major city. It was actually the empire of old was known as Carthage, who were very big rivals to the Roman Empire, is where Tunisia is right there. And pretty much this entire trade system is going to be ruined by Columbus because the Atlantic system, as you guys know, is going to raid very heavily in the empires of Ghana, Mali, Timbuktu, and Songhai. West Africa is where very, very, very many slaves are going to be deported from and kidnapped from. But the whole system is ruined by Columbus because that international sea trade really, really takes over and replaces the trade by desert and by the Saharan trade route. So that's going to be one of the major influences that lead to it. And we're going to look at the influence of gold is going to lead to a lot of prosperous wealth. But also what's going to be huge in the ancient world or in this part of the world is going to be salt. Salt is going to be huge in this area as well. But as you can see, most of these routes all go to one place, which is Timbuktu. All right, so let's now look at the Bantu migrations. The Bantu migrations were out of the old, what was called the kind of like the heart of civilization. So where these first people came from, and kind of like near Kenya and Tanzania. Is going to be where these areas, kind of Lake Victoria, is where all this kind of area is going to come from, these Bantu migrations. They're going to eventually go to Great Zimbabwe and build a major kingdom down there, an ancient kingdom that we actually have some archaeological evidence of, but not a lot of written evidence. The Swahili states in modern-day Somalia and down the coast of Tanzania are going to be some major places. And then they're also going to go up to the Niger River and form where these very major places are, the Bantu migration. All right. So this is important to know that this was not a once time only event. This was happened over a long period of time. About 1,000 years is these migrations eventually took over. People, typically groups of people, tribes, nomads would travel out from this area and then go from the Niger River to the Congo Valley was one direction that they would go. And that was the Bantu migration. And then from there, from West Africa down south towards the Congo Valley, you would have a lot of different influences. You had the rise of farming. You had different ceramics and iron opened up new farmlands. And so the southern part of Africa was really, really, really influenced by this culture, this great migration that happened, this Bantu migration. And so by about 300 CE, we have a rise of different city-states. We've got new kingdoms being built, and they're being fueled by this migration. So the Bantu migration has a major effect on South Africa and really all of Africa by spreading and taking the things that were very common along the rivers in North Africa and West Africa, and then spreading that further south. One of the big places that we're going to look at, as you can see in this bottom right picture here, is still available. It still exists a little bit. They have some evidence of this. Is Great Zimbabwe, a major stone city. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe is going to be one of the major kingdoms of the South that we're going to see. And it was made completely out of stone. Huge walls, about 15 feet high. And they were just used on walls. So there was no mortar. So mortar is kind of like what we consider like concrete. It's like a paste that holds the stones together. These walls were just placed so well and so efficiently that none of that was needed. The Portuguese were the first to actually have a written record of this in 1521. After the Kingdom of Zimbabwe had already fallen, and so this Great Zimbabwe was a deserted area that was discovered about a little under 100 years after it collapsed. So let's take a look at this great Bantu migration here, and what I want you guys to think about is how this is similar to the connections to the past. So let's take a look at these Bantu migrations.
Even today, the continent of Africa is composed of thousands of different tribal groupings. Each is subtly distinct from the next in custom and language.
Such diversity means that most Africans have to master more than one language, and they acquire those skills at a very young age. After a little exposure to these different languages, you begin to realize one thing. They all sound remarkably similar. I'm fascinated with languages, and wherever I've been going, I'm asking Africans, what's your language, and tell me some words in your language. So here's what I found out for the word for sun. In the Nyanja language, sun is Zuba. In the Bemba language, it's Akasuba. In Chiwa, it's Duzuba. And in the Senga language, it's Zuba again. Or the word for water. In the Nyanja language, it's Manzi. And in Bemba, it's Amenshi. And in Chiwa, it's Manzi. Similar to each other again. What do these linguistic similarities tell us? That there is a common root for most of the modern languages of tropical Africa. A single ancestral language, spoken by a single group of people, from which the many languages of today have descended.
Linguistic analysis has isolated a family of languages known as Bantu, which originated in tropical West Africa. About 5,000 years ago, the early Bantu speakers began to spread into new lands, bringing their crops, their animals, and their language with them. And over centuries, Bantu culture evolved, diversifying into hundreds of tribes, expanding across the tropical region of Africa. But the truth of this Pan-African civilization was suppressed for many years. Dr. Alex Skurman is trying to overturn the legacy of South Africa's racist past. She has been excavating an archaeological site on the banks of the Limpopo River.
In the early part of the 20th century, there were rumors in the white South African community about this place, in their minds linked to the Queen of Sheba or some other early white civilization in southern Africa, trying to show that the Phoenicians or the Sabaeans, basically anybody who was a bit lighter skinned than Africans, were here first, and that they found the opposite, that Africans actually had an amazing great history and that they had earlier states running way before any white set foot in Africa.
All right, so as you guys are thinking about that video, I want you to pay attention really much to the influence that this migration has had even on Africa today, and how that influence has related to the people who live there now. All right, so we're going to talk about Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe was a kingdom that was influenced by the Bantu speakers. So after the Bantu migration happened and moved south, the people brought their culture with them. They brought the technology of stonemasonry, of building. They brought the farming, the huts, the villages, the domestication of animals. All this stuff was all present in Zimbabwe. They've also found evidence of pottery and painting and all this kind of stuff that we see from a lot of other civilizations in the rest of the world was all present in Great Zimbabwe. What was really interesting about it, it was this giant stone wall that was created. So it shows that there had to have been some sort of governmental structure, some sort of leader, some sort of religious worship. They had all of the foundations that you would see in a regular civilization. And so Great Zimbabwe is one of those examples of a city that really was a high functioning civilization. And it was found in the southern part of Africa, where not a lot of other kingdoms were recorded. There's not a lot of archaeological evidence of other kingdoms at the same time. So Great Zimbabwe really stood alone. It was also a major port for trade. And so oftentimes if you were trading in the Indian Ocean on the coast of the African eastern coast, this is one of the places that would end up on the trade routes. And so this kingdom, although we don't really know exactly how it fell, whether it was famine, whether it was disease, we're not quite sure. Kind of like a lot of other civilizations, we're just not quite sure. But this civilization itself is really important. So I want you guys And one of the other things about this is just how incredible these stones have still lasted. I mean, this is Great Zimbabwe today, as those stone and those walls, about 30 feet high, have still survived the test of time, even in the tough African climates. So as we watch, not yet. Also, some things that they found in Africa was this stone masonry, and this is one of the major things that was in Zimbabwe, is the soapstone birds found near Greater Zimbabwe. So it must have either had a religious influence or cultural influence. But believe it or not, in 1980, the nation of Zimbabwe, which exists today, adopted that symbol for their flag. So it shows kind of the connection between the past and the present there. Shows it's pretty strong. All right, so we're going to watch this video on Great Zimbabwe. I want you guys to pay close attention to pretty much how they are describing this civilization right here.
Stretched across a tree-peppered expanse in southern Africa lies the magnificent ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a medieval stone city of astounding wealth and prestige. Located in the present-day country of Zimbabwe, it's the site of the largest known settlement ruins in sub-Saharan Africa, second on the continent only to the pyramids of Egypt. But the history of this city is shrouded in controversy, defined by decades of dispute about who built it and why. Its name comes from the Shona word Madzimbabwe, meaning big house of stone, for its unscalable stone walls that reach heights of nearly 10 meters and run for a length of about 250 meters. For its grandeur and historical significance, it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986. Back in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was a thriving city. Spread across nearly 8 square kilometers, Great Zimbabwe was defined by 3 main areas: the hill complex, where the king lived, the Great Enclosure, reserved for members of the royal family, and the Valley Complex, where regular citizens lived. Rulers were both powerful economic and religious leaders for the region. At its highest point, the city had a bustling urban population of 18,000 people and was one of the major African trade centers at the time. What enabled this growth was Great Zimbabwe's influential role in an intercontinental trade network. Connected to several key city-states along the East African Swahili coast, it was part of the larger Indian Ocean trade routes. The city generated its riches by controlling the sources and trade of the most prized items: gold, ivory, and copper. With this mercantile power, it was able to extend its sphere of influence across continents, fostering a strong Arab and Indian trader presence throughout its zenith. Archaeologists have since pieced together the details of this history through artifacts discovered on site. There were pottery shards and glassworks from Asia, as well as coins minted in the coastal trading city of Kilwa Kisiwani, over 1,500 miles away. They also found soapstone bird figures, which are thought to represent each of the city's rulers. And young calf bones, only unearthed near the royal residence, show how the diet of the elite differed from the general population. These clues have also led to theories about the city's decline. By the mid-15th century, the buildings at Great Zimbabwe were almost all that remained. Archaeological evidence points to overcrowding and sanitation issues as the cause, compounded by soil depletion triggered by overuse. Eventually, as crops withered and conditions in the city worsened, the population of Great Zimbabwe is thought to have dispersed and formed the nearby Mutapa and Torwa states. Centuries later, a new phase of Great Zimbabwe's influence began to play out in the political realm, as people debated who had built the famous city of stone. During the European colonization of Africa, racist colonial officials claimed the ruins couldn't be of African origin. So, without a detailed written record on hand, they instead relied on myths to explain the magnificence of Great Zimbabwe. Some claimed it proved the Bible story of the Queen of Sheba, who lived in a city of riches. Others argued it was built by the ancient Greeks. Then, in the early 20th century, after extensive excavation at the site, the archaeologist David Randall McIver presented clear evidence that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous peoples. Yet, at the time, the country's white minority colonial government sought to discredit this theory because it challenged the legitimacy of their rule. In fact, the government actively encouraged historians to produce accounts that disputed the city's African origins. Over time, however, an overwhelming body of evidence mounted, identifying Great Zimbabwe as an African city built by Africans. During the 1960s and 70s, Great Zimbabwe became an important symbol for the African nationalist movement that was spreading across the continent. Today, the ruins at Great Zimbabwe, alluded to on the Zimbabwean flag by a soapstone bird, still stand as a source of national pride and cultural value.
All right, so one of the things to think about as in that area is kind of how did they interact? How did Great Zimbabwe interact with other cultures, both past and present, whether it was Islamic or Europeans, and how does that influence the history of Africa? All right, so let's take a look at the next one here, which is the Empire of Ghana. Ghana was really the first major empire of West Africa that we have archaeological evidence of. It lasts from about 300 to 1200 CE, so really one of the longest lasting empires right here, right along the Niger River. It predates Islam, so there were a lot of the what they were called animist or kind of spiritual religions of Africa that had kind of existed. They also led to the domestication of camels, and as the arrival of Arabic traders came, this led to an increased trade in the region and became a lot more powerful as a major trade empire, as it had gold, which is one of the biggest things that they had in this area. One of the things about the Empire of Ghana is that all the gold belonged to the king. It was all belonged to the king. The people were allowed to keep gold dust. So you could tell a lot of the people were not doing too very well. The king himself did very, very well, but the people did not. There's a book called The Book of Roads and Kingdoms, which was written by Muslim writers in the year 1068. Remember, Cordoba was in Spain. And it talks about accounts of travelers from sub-Saharan Africa. So we do have evidence of Islam starting to show up in the Ghana government around this time. Eventually, you have people such as the treasurers, interpreters, and as that kind of becomes part of, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the religion of Ghana, but you can start to see that Islam is spreading to this area of the world. And we're going to see that a little bit later on with the spread of Islam into other empires. The decline of Ghana is pretty debated. There is a Tunisian scholar named Ibn Khaldun. He said the Almoravids, who were Islamic people in kind of like North Africa, a little bit further north, which he described as the veiled people, defeated them. So there's maybe influence that there was a war between the Kingdom of Ghana and those Islamic new rulers and new states that kind of became around them. But by the end of it, Ghana did become pretty much fully Islamic, and it becomes absorbed by the next empire that we're going to look at, which is Mali. So Mali right here, as you can hear in the background, was formed by a very, very famous emperor, Sundiata Keita, who ruled from 1217 to 1255. And Sundiata has a really interesting origin story, believe it or not. He was born to the king of Mali, and called the Buffalo Woman, who was a pretty not well-described woman. She was a hunchback, so she had physical deformities. She was physically disabled. And so Sundiata was actually born the same way. He was born physically disabled. He would have been considered someone who was unfit to rule when he was first born. So he didn't walk until he was much, much older. Eventually, his father dies, and he becomes exiled. He has to eventually leave the Empire of Mali and go on kind of like a journey. And so he goes to Ghana, and he gets the support of the old remnants of Ghana, and he returns and defeats the new bad king that is now in the Kingdom of Mali, and he becomes the first Mansa, the first emperor of Mali. So this is kind of what's going on with Sundiata. Hopefully you can hear some similarities between that and the past. We don't have a ton of info on this area. Well, I guess we're just going to listen to the Lion King. So there's not a ton of info on this area. There's not a lot of written record. Although Mansa Musa, who's going to eventually become the ruler a couple generations after Sundiata, is going to become the major ruler of this area. There you go. All right. Nope. All right. Sundiata is going to be, Mansa Musa is going to be a devout Muslim. So remember, we talked about the Empire of Ghana, which is going to collapse. And then he is going to be the one who takes over that. He's going to be a very, very famous pilgrim. He's going to travel a lot to the Middle East, travel to the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. He'd bring a huge group of people with him, about 60,000 people. They'd bring tons and tons of gold, and they would build these mosques every Friday. So he would have this major spread of religion between the Empire of Mali, Timbuktu, and between that area and the Middle East. He is known for the destroyer of the Mediterranean economy, because not necessarily physically destroying it with an empire, with an army, but just how huge the trans-Saharan trade routes gets. The way he's going to make so much money is not necessarily through gold, although he has gold, but salt. Salt becomes a major, it was actually worth more than its weight in gold, believe it or not. Most of the way on the way back, he'd have people traveling through here, and such because he had such influence, he would actually charge interest to help people out. And so a very, very smart businessman, as he kind of was able to control one of the major trade routes of the world at this time. All right, so what I want you to do now is to kind of look at the comparison between the Emperor of Mali, Sundiata, and the Lion King. So I want you to think about, what are the similarities?
From the 13th century African west coast comes an epic story about the rise of the grand kingdom of Mali. This is that story. The story of betrayal and loss, of friendship and love, of glory and pride. This is the story of Sundiata, the Lion King. The prosperous kingdom of Kongaba was ruled by the mighty King Magon. The great king and his ugly hunchback of a wife bore a son. His name was Sundiata. The king's advisor, a Miss Fukria, prophesied that Sundiata would be the greatest king ever. But Sundiata was born crippled and mute. He was teased relentlessly, everyone calling him the crying lion. You stupid crying lion, you! Despite everything, his father still believed in him and tried to spend as much time as he could with him. Meanwhile, the neighboring kingdom of Sasa was ruled by the evil Sumanguru. He built up a vast army and mounted an attack on the peaceful Congo. He conquered the kingdom, killing King Neba and all but one of his 12 sons. The last son, Sundiata, survived and fled the kingdom. While in exile, Sundiata forged alliances with other West African states and fell in love. No, that never happened.
What?
Back in the conquered Kongaba, Sumanguru ruled as a cruel and ruthless tyrant. He was a military ruler who neglected agriculture and led to political and economic instability. Crops were perishing. His subjects were starving. Sundiata's mother, however, continued to resist the evil Sumanguru.
Do that. I am a king. I can do whatever I want. You were a keeper. That's what I am.
Supported by his West African allies, Sundiata returned to his homeland and was devastated to see the kingdom in such disrepair. Sundiata attacked Sumanguru, and the ferocious battle of Karina ensued. Defeating Sumanguru and his royal subjects, Sundiata emerged as the victor.
he declared himself the king of the new kingdom of Mali. King Sujata was the greatest Malian king in history, bringing hope, peace, sovereignty, and prosperity to Mali. Sujata fulfilled Griot's prophecy and was henceforth bestowed the grandest title of all, the Lion King.
So a pretty cool story if you did not already know about the real story of the Lion King. It is based on a real prophecy in the real ancient history of the Kingdom of Mali. So I want you to think about what were some similarities that you saw between the movie and the actual history right there. All right, so next up, we are going to look at the ruler, Emperor Mansa Musa, and kind of his influence into the region as well. One of the further, I think he was 2 generations later after Sundiata.
If someone asked you who the richest people in history were, who would you name? Perhaps a billionaire banker or corporate mogul like Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller. How about African King Musa Kita I? Ruling the Mali Empire in the 14th century CE, Mansa Musa, or the King of Kings, amassed a fortune that possibly made him one of the wealthiest people who ever lived. But his vast wealth was only one piece of his rich legacy. When Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, much of Europe was racked by famine and civil wars. But many African kingdoms and the Islamic world were flourishing, and Mansa Musa played a great role in bringing the fruits of this flourishing to his own realm. By strategically annexing the city of Timbuktu and re-establishing power over the city of Gaul, he gained control over important trade routes between the Mediterranean and the West African coast, continuing a period of expansion which dramatically increased Mali's size. The territory of the Mali Empire was rich in natural resources, such as gold and salt. The world first witnessed the extent of Mansa Musa's wealth in 1324, when he took his pilgrimage to Mecca. Not one to travel on a budget, he brought a caravan stretching as far as the eye could see. Accounts of this journey are mostly based on an oral testimony and differing written records, so it's difficult to determine the exact details. But what most agree on is the extravagant scale of the excursion. Chroniclers describe an entourage of tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians, and slaves, 500 heralds, bearing gold staffs and dressed in fine silks, and many camels and horses bearing an abundance of gold bars. Stopping in cities such as Cairo, Mansa Musa is said to have spent massive quantities of gold, giving to the poor, buying souvenirs, and even having mosques built along the way. In fact, his spending may have destabilized the regional economy, causing mass inflation. This journey reportedly took over a year, and by the time Mansa Musa returned, tales of his amazing wealth had spread to the ports of the Mediterranean. Mali and its king were elevated to near legendary status, cemented by their inclusion on the 1375 Catalan Atlas. One of the most important world maps of medieval Europe, it depicted the king holding a scepter and a gleaming gold nugget. Mansa Musa had literally put his empire and himself on the map. But material riches weren't the king's only concern. As a devout Muslim, he took a particular interest in Timbuktu, already a center of religion and learning prior to its annexation. Upon returning from his pilgrimage, he had the great Djinguereber Mosque built there with the help of an Andalusian architect. He also established a major university, further elevating the city's reputation and attracting scholars and students from all over the Islamic world. Under Mansa Musa, the empire became urbanized, with schools and mosques in hundreds of densely populated towns. The king's rich legacy persisted for generations, and to this day, there are mausoleums, libraries, and mosques that stand as a testament to this golden age of Mali's history.
All right, so as you guys watch that video, I want you to think about how did Mansa Musa use his economic power to increase the spread of Islam in the region? All right. All right. So who were the richest people that ever lived? Well, if you were trying to make a list, you might think of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, all those different people because they make so much money now. But if you were to take the money that they made at the time and put them in today's dollars, this is what the list would be. So at $400 billion in today's wealth, Mansa Musa was number one. So obviously you guys know that. But let's take a look at where the wealth falls for other people, the top 10 richest people in history. Number 10 was Cornelius Vanderbilt, inventor of one of the major monopolies of the railroad in the early 1900s. Cornelius Vanderbilt, named for Vanderbilt University, was about half of the wealth. So 2 Cornelius Vanderbilts to every Mansa Musa. Henry Ford, right around the same era, obviously the inventor of the automobile, about today's wealth, about $199 billion. Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, who is now since deceased, was about about half of what Mansa Musa had today. William the Conqueror, who eventually is going to conquer the Kingdom of England and turn it into English, take it away from the Anglo-Saxons at the time, around 1066 AD. He is going to be worth about $230 billion as he becomes the first king of England. Osman Ali Khan, one of the early rulers of India, 236 billion. Tsar Nicholas, the last czar of the Russian Empire before he and his family are executed by the communist revolutionaries. Tsar Nicholas worth about 300 billion. Andrew Carnegie built this steel empire worth right around the same time as Cornelius Vanderbilt, worth about 310. John D. Rockefeller with his oil industry worth 340. And then second place, Cornelius Rothschild in the banking industry. Way back in English history, in the beginning of the origins of banking. Still, $50 billion less than the wealth of Mansa Musa. So really is the richest man in human history. All right, so let's take a look at the cultural city of Timbuktu. Was a major trade center of West Africa and eventually was taken over by Mansa Musa after he returned from the Hajj. And he eventually builds a very famous mosque right here. And it becomes one of the major Islamic cultural centers in the world. He has Islamic scholars that would go and work here and translate texts, and becomes a major hub and part of the pilgrimage that many Muslims even today still go to. As they said in the video, the Catalan Atlas was probably the most complete world map of the time, which even included Indian and Chinese cities. And if you'll notice, all these areas point straight to the city of Timbuktu as a major trade center in West Africa. And then Mansa Musa himself holding up the golden globe and as showing offering of gold to an Islamic merchant over here on the left. Just about Timbuktu, it was a very major city. It's going to thrive during the Mali and then later the Songhai empires that are going to replace them. Becomes a major center for gold as well as slaves. The slave trade was going on in the Islamic Empire. This was unfortunately not something that was new to the Europeans at the time, although they are going to totally transform what the slave trade does look like. In 1591, the city is going to fall to Moroccan invaders, very similar to what happened to the Empire of Ghana at the same time. So these Moroccan invaders really do a very efficient job of taking down these West African empires. Eventually, these trade routes are going to spell the doom for Timbuktu because this is going to lead to the rise of slave and gold trade is going to move to further and further to the coast. So the Atlantic trade is going to basically destroy the old trans-Saharan trade routes. Let's take a look at this video of Timbuktu.
An African El Dorado legend, Timbuktu. The city of Timbuktu is at the southern tip of the Sahara Desert. This small city has many houses made with adobe. Timbuktu was founded during the 11th century and thrived on trade across the Sahara. In the 16th century, an estimated 100,000 people lived in the city. Caravans still cross the desert and come to the city several times a year. The caravans often carry rock salt extracted from the northern Sahara. Timbuktu was an important Saharan trading point, where salt from the north was exchanged for gold from the south. The Empire of Mali levied a trading tax on salt and gold, and that made it very rich. The empire prospered. And Timbuktu was believed to be a city of gold. The legend began when Kankan Musa, the emperor during Mali's heyday, spent huge amounts of gold as he travelled through many cities on his way to Mecca. Many explorers headed to Timbuktu to find their fortune. However, they were to discover that the town only traded in gold and it was not found naturally there. In the mid-15th century, the Songhai Empire captured the town. Askir was the last emperor of the Songhai Empire and built many mosques and schools in Timbuktu. The city became known as a major center for religious and academic learning in Africa. Sankore Mosque is one of the important sites in Timbuktu. Next to the mosque is a university. A local historian looks after a collection of more than 10,000 books from the Askir period. Askir was the first emperor who brought books to the empire. Some were written in the 10th century. They covered subjects ranging from mathematics to law, from history to astronomy. The Songhai Empire was destroyed by Morocco in the 16th century. However, Askir's descendants managed to keep these important books safe, sometimes having to hide them underground. Once a year, people gather at Sankore Mosque to celebrate Mawlid, the birthday of Islam's prophet Muhammad. The lively festival recreates the atmosphere when the city was at the height of its glory.
All right, so taking a look at Timbuktu right there, that is an influence of what it looks like today, but also the history of it as well. All right, so next up, we're going to look at who replaced the Mali Empire, which was the Songhai. The Songhai are going to, as the Mali Empire dissolves, the battles are going to kind of divide it up of who's going to rule it, and leading to the rise of the Songhai who take advantage of this. The Songhai took back the city of Gao, and eventually lasts for nearly 150 years under the rule of about 9 kings. Mali gets a lot of the press, but the largest African empire, the wealthiest sub-Saharan empire, and the most powerful sub-Saharan empire, the answer for that is the Songhai. It was a short-lived empire, but the ruler, the real MVP, the real powerful Dia or king, was Asikia Muhammad the Great. He was a devout Muslim, but he was tolerant of non-Muslims, very similar to what we saw in Mali. He completed a similar pilgrimage as Mansa Musa did. He created a major center around Gao. He kind of made that the capital. It was the greatest city according to the ancient Muslim traveler Ibn Battuta, and that's really going to become one of the major influences as well. Also, some other kingdoms to know about: the kingdom of Aksum is kind of right under Cairo. It was kind of became powerful because it was a major stop between Rome to India. That was kind of where it was known for. It was named very famous for this architectural giant pillar known as the Stelae. After around 330, they become Christian. This is actually one of the African Christianity kingdoms that eventually exists. But a lot of the African kingdoms that were Christian had to be pretty friendly with the Islamic world, considering how close they were. I mean, they are right across the Gulf there, right across the Gulf right across the Persian Gulf into the cities of Mecca and Medina. Also, we have the Swahili city-states in modern-day Tanzania and Somalia. The Greeks called it the Zanj, or the land of the blacks. It was a very powerful trade center, but all these different tribes were that's where it was known for. But around the rise of the Indian Ocean trade, you had these city-states. Each of them eventually rose up, and they were named for the language that took hold here, which is still spoken today, which is Swahili. And so it's kind of a combination of Arabic and the Bantu languages, and that's where the language Swahili comes from. So very powerful trade city-states that existed along the eastern coast of Africa. All right, so that is going to wrap us up. There is one more thing I'm going to add on, which is going to be the 5 things in review. So just hold on one second. All right, so taking a look at the things that you should know from this slide. The first thing is Africa begins to join the rest of Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia via the 2 trade routes, the Trans-Saharan and the Indian Ocean trade, really gets Africa involved. The Trans-Saharan trade routes in West Africa, kingdoms of Mali and Ghana and Songhai, and then the East African coast, the Swahili trade coast, and even also the great Zimbabwe becomes very influenced by these trade routes. Number 2, besides the local religious beliefs, Africa, especially in Ethiopia, especially in West Africa and East Africa, which is dominated by Islam, except the areas of Aksum in Ethiopia, which is going to become Christian. So North Africa, West Africa is very dominated by Islam. 3, the empire to know about in this period is Mali, founded by Sundiata Keita, who is the basis for the movie The Lion King. So the Mali is the very, very big one to know about. They are the founders, especially in the ones who are very famous in that West African kingdoms. Number 4, Mansa Musa is very, very famous. He's the most globally famous person from Africa in this period. Knowing this story alone gets you a ton of info on Africa, because if you know the story of Mansa Musa, you know the story of the influence of Islam, the influence of trans-Saharan trade with gold and salt, the influence of wealth, and kind of able to control those trade routes, the rise of the kingdom, and the capital of Timbuktu and the influence there. So if you really know Mansa Musa, it's kind of like your back way in to really knowing about what's happening with Africa in this period. And then lastly, number 5, the Swahili coast of the southeast connects Africa to the Indian Ocean trade. And thus, if you're connecting Africa to the Indian Ocean, you're connected to China, Southeast Asia, and India as well. So that's kind of the too long didn't read of this version. If you guys need to go back and look at those videos, that is something I recommend. But that is going to wrap us up for 1.5 talking about Africa.